Hello. I want to share a story with you today. It's a Bible story. I would say it's probably used to be my second favorite story. I think now it's my favorite story. But before I share the story, I want to give you a couple of warnings. The first warning is that we're going to be talking about doubt. One of the reasons, it's kind of a paradox that happens in the church, one of the reasons why the church is uncomfortable talking about doubt isn't because they don't care. It's a quite common phenomenon within the church. But the problem is that when I speak about my doubts, there's always a danger that you will take them and say, oh, yeah, one more thing to doubt. I don't want that to happen. I want to share about doubts to encourage you. But if I'm going to be honest about my doubts, those doubts may add to your burden. And people are reluctant to do that. So what happens is that the church doesn't address doubts very often. They don't talk about them. And unfortunately, those who are going through doubts feel very isolated, not realizing that when they gather with Christians, they're just as likely to hide their doubts and continue the feeling of isolation. So I want to end that feeling of isolation by addressing it. So the warning is, if you don't struggle with doubt, feel free to turn this off. As a matter of fact, I encourage you to turn this off. You might enjoy the story, but the heart of those doubts is not something that I want to share or pass on with you. So feel free to turn this off, find another one of mine, or find someone else's. I'm good with that. The second warning that I want to give you is that, and you have figured this out, unless this is your first of my videos that you're watching, my hermeneutics are not orthodox. I tend to look for different things that will improve my interpretation. The result is that when I read a story in the Bible, I tend, rather than to want to study context, to study language, to study commentary, I want to reverse engineer the story. When something odd happens in that story, I tend to want to put myself in that position and say, well, why would I do that? Doesn't make sense. And oftentimes when I think about why would I do what the character did, I feel like I have a new perspective. Is it right? I don't know. But I am going to reverse engineer a story. And as I have told this story, reverse engineered, I have found so much encouragement from an unexpected source. So the things that I tell you about this story are not things that you can go and find in a commentary. They are things that if I were living through this story, or inasmuch as I have lived through similar experiences, these were the motivations and the reasons and the causes. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. I think that if you go back to the story in Daniel, you will find that while my interpretation may not be the dominant, that it's not exactly precluded by the text. At least that's my hope. But I might introduce some things that are extraneous. Feel free to ignore them, or feel free to turn this off. Find another offering. There might be one or two more things on YouTube. I don't know. Okay, so there's lots more you could watch. But let me pray before we begin. Father, the things that I want to share with whoever you call to watch this video are things that have encouraged me, not discouraged me. I pray that those who are looking for that encouragement that I can share, they would find themselves drawn. I pray that others would find themselves distracted, turn to something else. And I pray that your words would shine through. Amen. The story I want to tell you is a story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But their story begins with another story. And that is the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you had the privilege of sitting at my dinner table, you would be amazed at the conversations that go on, I think. We talk about a lot of odd topics, and certainly on a number of occasions we've talked about the challenges of taking over the world. I don't know if that's useful, but it does anchor itself in a lot of history. A lot of people have tried to take over the world and have found challenges. One of the men who did that was a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar took over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. He took over a more dominant society. And as a result, he had a lot of respect for that society. He taught within his kingdom the teachings and the readings of the Chaldeans, even though he himself had not been brought up in that. So he took over a society and adopted from that society the strongest parts. And then Nebuchadnezzar went on to build his Babylonian kingdom. So it was based on Chaldean roots, but it was a Babylonian kingdom. And pretty soon there was a drastic problem that faced him. The problem was that there were more thems than us's. So I'm going to use my high-tech digital interface. It's actually analog interface. And I'm going to use this whiteboard. And let me show you what I mean. Here was the Babylonian kingdom. That was Babylon. We'll put that in there. And I'll put the us, not for United States, but that's the us's in this story. That's Nebuchadnezzar and his people. Well, as he went on to continue to conquer the known world, he conquered various countries. So he conquered this country. And we're going to call these them one. And he wasn't satisfied. So pretty soon he conquered them two. And then he conquered them three. And them four. And them five. And them six. And them seven. And do you see the problem? There are more thems than us's, which could be a severe problem if you're Babylonian. If the thems ever decided that they didn't like the us's, there are more of them than us. And Nebuchadnezzar needed to have a solution. The solution that he chose was something that we're very familiar with. The solution he chose was multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has two facets. The first facet is a very powerful facet. It was part of our country. It was called the melting pot. Or maybe you'd call it potluck. We took from the societies that came to join us, even though we weren't conquering them, we took the best ideas from them. I just had some potato chips for lunch. And they weren't invented by the English people who came. Apparently they were invented by a native, which is pretty cool, right? You think about how you could go out for Mexican food. We took Mexican food. It's part of our society. Although we didn't take all Mexican food. You go to Taco John's and you could get tacos or burritos. They don't have menudo on the menu. We left that behind. Do you see what happened in this melting pot is that as a bunch of countries joined a central country, all that was best from those countries was adopted by the dominant culture. So in Babylon, they took the best of them two. They took the best of them one. They took the best of them seven. The best of them five. The best of them four. The best of them six. The best of them three. To make a stronger, more powerful, more agile, and effective Babylonian culture. Great. That's the power of multiculturalism. But the power of multiculturalism did not change the basic dynamic here. Remember, I said there are more thems than there are us's. And if any point in time the thems rise up against the us's are lost. So what do you have to do? Well, this is the other half of multiculturalism. And Nebuchadnezzar understood it very well. And that is, you have to let each group of them retain their own political identity. Not political power, but political identity. The them ones need to see themselves as very different culturally from the them twos. The them twos need to maintain their cultural difference from the M3s. The M3s have to be different from the 4s and the 6s and the 5s and the 7s. Every culture that comes to become a part of this Babylonian core culture needs to stay fiercely loyal first to their own cultural identity, but subdued to the dominant culture. Multiculturalism works when it makes a strong central identity. Multiculturalism is about tyranny when it divides the thems so they cannot unite. When the thems have a sense of their identity that isolates them from everyone else, they allow the dominance, even the tyranny, of that central culture. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the United States. This us is just about them and us. Although, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? But for Nebuchadnezzar, it worked its way out in the story that I want to tell you. He was in a habit. Now, the reason I believe he was in a habit is because when the Hebrew children get to Babylon, they seem to take part of a bigger experience. But as it played out for these Israelites, when their kingdom was attacked, when the temple was sacked, and everything powerful was taken away, people were put to death, the king's head of his training department was called upon to identify several Israelite children who were especially talented, who were trained in their own beliefs. And he was going to bring them in, as we had one new, the them number 8 was actually Israel. To bring the strength of the Israelite nation, the strength of the Israelite concept of governance and worldview, to bring that strength into the umbrella of the Babylonian identity. And the way that he wanted to do this was to take these talented young men from Israel and to bring them into his court, so that whenever a question came up, he could say, what would an Israelite think of that? And by that, Nebuchadnezzar could govern without blind spots. It was a brilliant plan. It fit in his desire to keep power. Because remember, there's fundamentally for him a paranoia. What if the thems start coordinating? What if a rebellion sweeps through the thems? The us have no chance. So on one hand, he's paranoid of insurrection, but on the same time, he knows that if he can get the best information from each of these and bring it into his court, that he won't miss something vitally important. So, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were selected. And they were selected to take part of the king's training school. I told you that I was backwards engineer this. I had experience similar. My oldest son was selected to be part of our Air Force Academy, which for me as a parent is a great deal. Because you know how much I spent on my son's education? He got a world-class college education, and I spent none of my own money. I kind of like that. That academy experience gives me, I think, a little clue as to what was going on. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken back to Babylon, and they are selected, instead of having to be pushed in with the rest of the captives to Babylonian culture and carve their way, carve a niche into that society. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get to take part in the king's academy. This is a school that is, they eat the food that the king eats. It's prepared at the palace. They have landed on their feet, so to speak. They're going to get a chance to have an extravagant lifestyle and encouragement instead of opposition.